Hello and good morning. My name is Francine Harrigan and I'm with the United Nations Department of Public Information. We're very pleased to have you join us today for the launch of the United Nations World Economic Situation and Prospects 2017 report. Today, to tell us about the report's key findings, I'm pleased to welcome Under-Secretary General Liu Jianmin for the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, and Ms. Dawn Holland, Chief of the Global Economic Monitoring Unit, also UNDESA. USG Liu will provide introductory remarks and will then need to leave for a prior engagement, and Ms. Holland will then present the key findings of the survey. USG Liu, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. This is the second time I'm here. I'm coming here today to present this year's World Economic Situation and Prospects, or the WESP. This year's volume stands apart from recent editions, both in terms of the overall assessment of the world economy and the risks and challenges highlighted in the report. The WESP benefits from the collective expertise of economists across the UN system, including UNDESA, UNCTAD, and the 5 regional economic commissions of the United Nations, plus bodies such as the World Tourism Organization and the International Labour Organization. Our economists take a bottom-up approach in assessing the world economy. They look at individual countries and put together these individual parts into a complete picture of the world economy. Policymakers can then draw conclusions from this analytical work and incorporate relevant elements in their decision-making. The general economic backdrop conveyed in the report is more positive compared to recent years. The global economy is growing by 3%, the highest growth rate since 2011. About 2/3 of all countries are seeing stronger growth this year compared to last year, and steady global growth of 3% is forecast to continue next year and beyond. Of course, as encouraging as this is, significant problems remain that have wider social and environmental relevance. First, if you look at economic growth on a per capita basis, numerous countries and regions all redress environmental damage. Second, there is an environmental dimension to growth itself. Estimates suggest that global CO2 emissions have started to increase again in 2017, confronting the world community with a problematic message. While the upturn in global growth is a welcome sign of a healthy economy, it is important to remember that this may come at an environmental cost. This calls for stronger efforts to delink economic growth from environmental degradation, as also emphasized by the UN Climate Change Conference in Bonn last month. Then there is a continued challenge of creating decent jobs. While unemployment has declined in many countries, deeper labor market challenges remain, including high levels of underemployment, youth unemployment, and vulnerable forms of employment. With a more positive microeconomic forecast and these problems in mind, the report presents a compelling argument. Policymakers should use the current improvement in macroeconomic conditions to accelerate progress on fundamental development challenges. These include increasing the degree of economic diversification, especially in resource-reliant economies, reducing inequality, especially to lift people out of poverty, creating a global financial architecture that supports long-term investment needs, and building institutions that allow effective policymaking. Addressing these more fundamental issues has been difficult during the time of economic crisis. Over the last decade, various economic and financial crises largely crowded out our efforts to implement policy measures with a longer-term time horizon in mind. But grasping the opportunity now to bring about deeper and more fundamental change is urgently needed for sustained, inclusive, and sustainable growth over the medium term. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm leaving for the next event, and I shall leave the detailed.
Thank you. Dawn, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So as Undersecretary General Mr. Liu has already emphasized, this year's report on the world economic situation and prospects presents a somewhat more upbeat message than we have been able to deliver for more or less the past decade. The world economy has strengthened. That's one of the main messages. Many of the fragilities related to the global financial crisis and other recent crises, such as the undercapitalized banking systems, the widespread fiscal austerity programs, these have now eased. And crucially, we've seen that conditions for investment have improved in many countries. And this is essential to help drive the rebound in investment that is needed in order to kickstart productivity growth and in order to make progress towards sustainable development goals. The current forecast sees steady growth of 3% per annum in 2017, 2018, 2019. While the global economy is not devoid of risks, which are largely related to high levels of debt, uncertainties in international policy developments, and geopolitical tensions, what stands out at the current juncture is not these risks, but instead the synchronized upturn among major economies amid stable financial market conditions and the absence of other major negative shocks. The improvement in the global economic conditions offers greater scope for policymaking to shift away from the short-term focus that is inevitably part of coping with crises towards the longer-term issues, such as developing a low carbon economic growth, reducing inequalities, improving economic diversification, and eliminating some of the other deep-rooted barriers that hinder development. So what is behind the upturn? The world economy is expected to grow by 3% this year. As I said, this marks an upward revision to forecasts that we made 1 year ago, and that in itself is worthy of some note because it's the first time in many years that we've actually underestimated rather than overestimated the forecasts for the world economy looking 1 year ahead. It marks the highest rate of growth in the world economy since 2011, and a significant acceleration in global growth compared to just 2.4% growth that was recorded in 2016. Roughly 2/3 of the world's economies are seeing stronger growth this year than they saw in 2016. We've seen a rebound in world trade, which has been driven largely by stronger demand from East Asian economies, which is supported by policy stimulus measures there. East Asia and South Asia remain the world's most dynamic regions and together contribute to nearly half of global growth. But when we look at the shift in the global growth rate between 2016 and 2017, from 2.4% to 3%, the driving factor behind that stems largely from stronger growth in many developed economies. And we've also seen the end of recession in several large emerging economies, including Brazil, the Russian Federation, Argentina, and Nigeria. And together, that coming out of recession in those countries can account for roughly a third of the rise in global growth between the 2 years. So looking more specifically at what is driving the upturn in global growth, some revival in investment can explain roughly 60% of the acceleration in global growth in 2017. It's important to bear in mind that this improvement is from a relatively low starting point. We saw investment decline in many large economies last year, including Argentina, Brazil, Canada, the Russian Federation, South Africa, United Kingdom, and the United States. So coming out of contraction, is necessarily going to make a significant contribution in terms of growth. And also we've seen nearly a decade now of weak global investment overall, which continues to and will continue to weigh on prospects for productivity developments going forward. So while conditions for investment have improved, and investment is not expected to act as a drag on growth for the next couple of years, we still remain some ways away from making a full recovery from the decade-long weak investment that we've seen. So what are the factors that have improved? We see low financial volatility, reduced banking sector fragilities, recovery in some commodity markets, and a more solid macroeconomic outlook in general. In addition, financing costs generally remain low, despite the rise in interest rates that has begun in the United States. And spreads have narrowed so that the actual borrowing costs in many of the emerging markets have actually come down over the last year. Capital has started flowing back to developing economies, including a rise in cross-border lending, and this has supported stronger credit growth in both developed and developing economies. The report raises some particular concerns in relation to economic growth in per capita terms, and that stronger growth that we've seen has not necessarily been shared evenly across or within countries. After sharp declines in per capita income in 2016, we're expecting relatively negligible growth in per capita GDP, which can be interpreted as average incomes in countries in several parts of Africa, in Latin America, and in Western Asia over the next few years. The impacted regions combined are home to 275 million people living in extreme poverty, which underscores the urgent need to foster an environment that will both accelerate medium-term growth prospects and tackle poverty through policies that address inequalities in income and in opportunity. The uneven pace of global growth poses some risks for targets related to the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed by the member states of the United Nations as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. For example, very few of the least developed countries are expected to reach the Sustainable Development Goal target of GDP growth of at least 7% in the near term. Growth in many of these countries is held back by institutional deficiencies, inadequate basic infrastructure, high levels of exposure to natural disasters, as well as security concerns and political instability. The report also warns that under the current trajectory and without significant progress towards redressing inequality, the target of eradicating poverty by 2030 is likely to remain out of reach, particularly in Africa. The acceleration in economic growth that we've seen, while welcome in many respects, also increases the need to address the links between economic growth and environmental sustainability. Preliminary estimates suggest that the level of global energy-related carbon emissions increased in 2017 after 3 years of remaining unchanged. Stronger efforts are needed to de-link economic growth and environmental degradation. The frequency of weather-related shocks continues to increase, also highlighting the urgent need to build resilience against climate change and prioritize environmental protection. Renewable energy accounts for more than 1/2 of newly installed power capacity, but to date only accounts for a small share of global power generation, 11.3% is the estimate. Developed and developing countries alike both need to accelerate their transition towards sustainable clean energy. Despite the improved outlook, the global economy continues to face some risks. The risks highlighted in the report include changes in trade policy or a rise in protectionism, a sudden deterioration in global financial conditions, and rising geopolitical tensions. What might trigger a deterioration in global financial conditions? Well, the trigger could come from a number of different channels. The rise in global indebtedness itself, especially where debt is denominated in foreign currency, leaves many countries vulnerable to spikes in risk aversion, to sudden capital withdrawal, and to an abrupt tightening of global liquidity conditions. The gradual withdrawal of monetary stimulus in developed economies could potentially act as a trigger to deteriorate global financial conditions. The central banks in developed economies are operating in largely uncharted territory, especially in regards to reducing the size of their balance sheets. This means that this leaves a lot open in terms of uncertainties of the reactions to the policies and the appropriate speed and timing of the withdrawal. While it is expected to proceed gradually and steadily, there remain a number of risks for policy errors or misinterpretation of policy announcements. And finally, just to reiterate, the main policy message from the report is that the longer-term policy goals need to make their way to the forefront of policymaking. The 4 key areas that are highlighted include increasing economic diversification, reducing inequality, building financial architecture to support long-term investment needs, and tackling institutional deficiencies. These are not issues that can be solved overnight. They require long-term strategic planning, but the time to accelerate this process is now, before the next crisis hits and distracts attention away from these crucial goals. Thank you very much, and the full report is available in electronic format from this site.
Thank you, Dawn. With that, I'll open the floor to questions. Sure.
There was almost a chronic problem of inequality increasing. And I gather from what you were saying about per capita income not improving, this trend does not appear to be improving. What is the forecast in terms of the growth in inequality?
That's an excellent question. So tackling inequality is not something that economic growth in itself can do on its own. It's very much a policy driven. So what we need to see and what we encourage countries to do now is to start focusing more. I mean, it's really quite urgent. We have a target for 2030 of eradicating extreme poverty. That's not going to happen without starting now to redress these inequalities. So we propose a combination of short-term policies and which focus on supporting those who are most in need in the short term through redistribution policies, introducing more progressive tax and benefit schemes. Also, some of the, you can make improvements through policies like labor market policies that broaden access to the labor market, creating greater institutional transparency, and broadening access to finance or other ways that can help to integrate a greater number of individuals into the active economy and redress inequalities that way. We also need to look longer term and ensure that investment in education, expanding access to health care remain key priorities to ensure that the inequalities and opportunity begin to decrease. This is a long-term process, but we need to initiate them now to make sure that they can be achieved.
What are the institutional changes that would help bring this about?
So specific well, I mean, so some of the ones that I would, in general, increasing transparency in governance, increasing transparency in the legal system, increasing and transparency in the financial access would all help to progress towards reducing inequalities. Labor market barriers exist in many countries, especially for women. Tackling these now, these are difficult things to change quickly because they're deeply rooted in society, but introducing policy changes now that help to redress that and encourage girls into education, women into the labor market, can be very important in that direction as well.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. Thanks a lot. I was listening to it. I wanted to ask you, late last week, regulators, I think almost all over the world, have signed on to this Basel III capital accords, and I wanted to know if just, I guess, if you can say anything about the benefits or non-benefits of having kind of common capital standards. Also, whether DESA thinks that the reforms at the IMF over the last year have been conducive to greater equality and greater voice for developing economies. And there's something I'd wanted to ask, because we haven't gotten a straight answer here from, it's a DESA question. There was an event on November 21st where DESA, the Undersecretary General, and others held this an award ceremony, and it involved $1 million from something called China Energy Fund Committee, whose principal here at the UN, Patrick Ho, had been indicted several days before. So it's come up here several times why DESA went forward using this money after the indictment. And I wanted to know, maybe you may not be the right person, but I see many DESA people here, and I know the Undersecretary General was here. I'd only ask him because the spokesman hasn't answered it. You spoke about transparency. What's the status of DESA's, if you can either find or today somehow have somebody send, what's the status of the program, and in particular, why did DESA go forward with that $1 million after the indictment, given that the Secretary General canceled his photo op, given that the Deputy Secretary General didn't come? It seems like I just want to sort of understand what the UN's thinking was of the connection between the indictment and those funds. Thanks.
I think if I just jump in quickly, if you can take the first two questions, I think on the third, this would be outside of what we're discussing here, but let me follow up with the spokesperson and other relevant people, and we'll come back to you on that one. But Dawn, if you could take the first two. Thank you.
So in terms of developing common capital standards, in general, this should be supportive to economic growth, because having a common and understanding of rules will facilitate international transactions, will facilitate investments in cross-border investments. having what the global financial crisis taught us that was that having very clear system of regulation and transparent system of regulation is important, and that the pressures to draw back some of the regulation that has been put in place since 2008 should be viewed with some caution. While it may help improve profit making in the banking sector, it also increases the potential risks that the banking sector would face. So there has to be a very careful consideration of the trade-offs there. And I'm afraid I can't comment on the reforms of the IMF over the last year. It's interinstitutional. If there was anything specific that you wanted to ask about, I could perhaps.
The voting quota shares. I know it's something that Dessa and others have spoken about. The IMF has been saying it's trying to shift voting power to developing, more developing economies, and they've done some, but they haven't done much. I didn't know if you would have some view, or if you'd think that might have some impact on the global economic situation. But if not, I can't comment on it specifically,
although it seems like a correct way forward, a good way forward.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions from the floor? If not, let me thank our speaker presenter today, Dawn, and for all of you for joining us. That ends today's press conference. Thank you.